Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be around the world. I'd like to welcome you to the ACUOI Virtual Roundtable Global Perspective. My name is Mary DeNiro. I'm your CEO of ACUOI. Today we have panelists who are going to be able to share with you their perspectives around the coronavirus, what they are doing, and what has worked, and things that we need to look out for as we move along. For some of us, we are just entering into what it means to be stay at home, stay safe. For others, their countries are starting to open up. What does that mean for student accommodations? What does that mean as you think about how you can best serve those students whose parents put their care in your halls? We are delighted to welcome these panelists. As always, I would encourage you to go to akuoi.org to learn more about what we are doing, to learn about more of these video and virtual roundtables and the resources that we have. And of course, I thank all of you for being members of the association. And with that, I will turn it over to Spencer Giese and our panelists.
All right, thank you, Mary, and thanks for joining us today. For those of you attending, we hope that you're having a wonderful time, and we're so glad that you could spend some of your precious time with us as we talk about these topics. To do a couple technological pieces to make sure everything's working right on your end, you should be seeing a menu on Zoom where you also see a raised hand function. So if you are hearing us and you are having video come through on your end, if you could just hit the raise hand function just to show us that everything's working on your end. Excellence. A lot of raised hands. Thank you so much. Appreciate being active, enthusiastic participants today. In just a few moments, we're going to hear from our moderator and our panelists today, but I just want to talk about a few pieces of how this session is going to work. So really, our virtual roundtables are fueled by our attendees and how you all can interact with our panelists, how you can have your questions and topics be heard, and really you help direct where we go in our conversation. It's a free-flowing opportunity for you to be able to submit questions and comments in topical areas. So we ask that you use the Q&A function on your Zoom menu. It's a box, and when you use that Q&A function, submit a question that you'd like us to answer, or even a topic that you'd like us to talk about. And when you do so, if you could just include who you are. All of our questions and comments that are placed in the Q&A tab, they are visible to all the attendees. So you may see someone pose a question and you as another attendee have an answer or have a comment that you'd like to add to that. So really this can be a free-flowing conversation for you all using the Q&A function, as well as our moderator and panelists looking at those and helping to drive our conversation today. So thank you in advance for being active participants. The more active you are in this, the more robust our conversation really can be. But you all did not come to hear me talk about how we're going to do the session. You came to hear from our outstanding moderator and facilitators today. So I am going to throw it over to Jacob, and Jacob is going to start to lead our discussion. So thank you again, everyone, and I'll pass off to Jacob.
Alrighty, kia ora koutou everyone, no mai haere mai. Warm Pacific greetings from New Zealand, Aotearoa. It's 7 p.m. here on Thursday evening. We've had a long day of Zoom meetings, and I'm super excited to be able to help moderate the ACUOI roundtable. Special thanks to Mary, Laurie and Spencer, who I know it's an ungodly time in the United States there. A little bit about me. I'm Jacob Waitiri. I'm the head of accommodation operations for the University of Auckland here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We have 4,500 students that live with us in a variety of accommodation. And I'll allow the lovely panelists to introduce themselves, and we'll start with my next door neighbour, Edwina, over in Australia.
Thanks, Jacob, and thank you to ACUOI for hosting this and supporting this. It's really, really exciting to be here, and also just really exciting to see that we have so many participants listening in at probably all sorts of hours all over the world. Here it is 5:06 p.m, so it's a fairly decent hour for myself. So just to introduce myself properly, I am at the University of Wollongong, and my role there is the Senior Manager for Occupancy and Communications. I'm also quite active with the Kuhoi too. I'm currently the Globalization Director, and this is my first year as the Globalization Director, so I couldn't have asked for a more, I guess, challenging remit when I took on this role. COVID sort of first came on the radar in Australia probably late January, and I remember just being really, really excited because I was getting, I was all geared up to go over to my first face-to-face Kuhoi board meeting, executive board meeting, and I actually had to pull out hours beforehand because of the COVID crisis. And here we are, and it's just evolved more and more as the weeks and months, almost months, have rolled on. So yeah, to just give you a little bit of an overview at UOW, in our student accommodation, we have 2,500 beds. Occupancy, as you can probably imagine, has pretty much halved. We're probably sitting at about 40% occupancy. So we still do have students in residence. And what we've found is most of our domestic, or a large majority of our domestic students have departed. So it's certainly very, very interesting times. We still have a number of international students in residence, and we're, just working very hard with our student leaders and staff to deliver a support program for them and make sure that they're entertained and getting all the supports that they need. I'll probably leave it there because if I keep talking, the others might get a chance to talk. So I will now hand over to the GIN chair, which is Matthew.
Great, thanks, Edwina. Yeah, so as you said, I'm the Global Initiatives Network chair, and this is a very fortuitous or challenging time, I guess, depending on how you look at it. But lots of opportunities to connect as a global community, and that's why I'm glad Kuhoi is hosting this today, because I think it's a chance for everyone to support each other, and really looking forward to that. My day job, I guess, it is about 10 a.m., a little after 10 a.m. here in Qatar. I work as the head of residence life in Qatar Foundation, and we have, 9 institutions that are here. So we, student housing, are serving the 9 different universities. Our capacity is around 1,200 beds, but similar to what has been shared, we've had lots of movements out of student housing, but we have a lot of international students that just aren't able to go home, closed borders or restrictions in their home countries or where their families are, where they're not able to go there. And so as we near the end of with our second term and graduation within 3 weeks, we will likely have students into the summer here that will continue on. And we're in about week 4 of homestay and working from home with no foreseeable end in sight. So we're kind of planning for that. I think similar to Edwina, lots of interesting challenges. I think what makes it interesting and more complicated for us is just coordinating with the 9 institutions. So obviously the government is giving direction. Each of the universities, for those that have home campuses, they're getting direction from there. And we're trying to obviously guide students through all of that. So excited to share more about that in this forum and to hear what questions that you all have. But welcome.
Brilliant. We'll have Elizabeth.
Good morning, everyone from Berlin, Germany. It's a little past 9 a.m. here. My name is Elizabeth Cox. I work for a private developer and operator called Basecamp Student. We have a little over 1,500 beds, and we operate in 3 different countries, Germany, Denmark, and Poland. We are currently open, and so like many of the colleagues here, we had seen an initial kind of repatriation, particularly of our international students. And some of our domestic students have chosen to go home, but are ready to come back as well. But we are still open and operating. And so again, like many of you, trying to figure out how to build community and to make sure that our students feel engaged and safe, and that parents and families also feel safe. And now discussing what new normal looks like. So yeah, oh, and I am in charge of the Residence Life program for our company. So yeah, I guess I will kick it off then to Rebecca over in the UK.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hi, everybody. My name is Rebecca, and I'm speaking to you from a surprisingly sunny Manchester in the northwest of the UK. So for those of you who are big football or soccer fans, you know exactly where Manchester is. I am the head of partnerships and resident experience for the Student First group. So interestingly, I'm not based in an institution. Predominantly, a lot of my experience comes from the purpose-built student accommodation sector, which is the private sector, similar to what Elizabeth just discussed. So I will be talking to you very much about what's happening within that sector, but also across the HE sector in the UK as well. Purpose-built student accommodation in the UK is a pretty huge sector with about 40,000 beds in the UK and forecast to grow up to about 700,000 beds. So it's been very interesting to watch how that sector has responded, and there have been multiple approaches. So I'm excited to talk about that today.
Awesome. Kia ora, everyone, and thank you so much for those introductions. I can see we've got a lovely eager question. Thank you for that. It's always nerve-wracking to see if someone's going to ask a question. But before we go into answering that, I think maybe everyone's alluded to a little bit about what their current situation is in their country. But I suppose, you know, before we start talking about the return of students, which is what this question's asking, maybe shall we talk about, did your institution require students to leave campus and leave student accommodation or residential setting? So I can say that here in New Zealand, we're under what our government's called a COVID alert level 4, which is like home detention. But we were mandated to remain open and be an option for students to still live on campus. So while we've got distance learning for the rest of our academic year, which finishes at the end of July, or academic semester, we're still required to be open. So we've still got 1,400 students living on our campus, and everyone else made the personal choice to go home. Now, I'm just curious if other colleagues have taken, you know, if you can go home approaches, or they've encouraged people to stay. Just interested in how everyone's going in their current situation. So maybe Rebecca, will start off with you again and then go down the line.
So it's been quite interesting to see what's happened in the UK. We're into week 4 now of official lockdown, with no date being given for that to end. And so the UK government come under criticism for not acting sooner. There was no mandate from them to close universities. Actually, the universities kind of took matters into their own hands and started to close one by one and then followed suit. What was really interesting to watch was how they communicated to students. So some handled it very well, gave them sufficient notice to pack their belongings and contact the relevant people they needed to contact to go home. Whereas some gave them very little time and then didn't really take into consideration if a student was estranged, if they could afford to go home, if they could afford to fly home. Interestingly, talking to a lot of the private operators, I've heard from numerous operators, they've got anything from 10% up to 60% of residents still in house, and a lot of students staying for really interesting reasons. A lot of that has been they're staying because the Wi-Fi connection is better in the student accommodation than it is at home, and they're not traveling home because it's a difficult situation for them to be in, or they can't afford to travel home. So there was no mandate as such from the UK government, other than universities themselves decided to move their delivery of learning online, and then it followed from that.
Lovely. Elizabeth, what's happening in your neck of the woods?
So we saw a cascading effect, actually. So Denmark was actually the first of our countries to start to close the universities, and so we saw particularly North American students want to leave most quickly from that, and then the other countries in the kind of the EU continent started to follow. So we saw Germany start to move to distance education, and then Poland, and similar to what Rebecca said, we've seen, kind of depending on the country, different numbers of students who have decided to leave, some wanting to end their contracts, some wanting to just leave but want to keep their contracts in place because they don't know when the university will be back open. And so that's been interesting for us to be able to navigate those questions. I think one interesting experience that we had is one of the medical universities in Łódź, Poland, where we operate, needed to close their own dormitories, and I say that word intentionally. But that left many students, particularly international students, without a place to live. So that gave us an opportunity to support other students with some of the open beds that we have where they could quickly move, because those students, I think, had maybe 48 hours notice, and many of them were Spanish studying in Poland, and so they had no place to go. And so I think that was an interesting experience for us to be able to quickly support those students as they really had very little time. So now we are just also kind of keeping track of each of the 3 different governments as they try to figure out what the next steps are.
Brilliant. I'm so glad it's not just my own country that like to make mass changes in 48 hours notice.
Yes, yes.
Matthew, what's happening in Qatar?
Sure. So yeah, we're in, I guess, week 5 now. So it was around March 11th. The government, and Qatar Foundation is a governmental organization, so it's part of the government as well. But there's been good communication there and sharing with us. It's been a somewhat gradual approach. So I think there was an initial, spike in number of cases, and at that point, universities decided to go to online education only for the rest of the semester, for the rest of the term. And so that meant students didn't need to be actually physically within Qatar Foundation to be attending classes. In terms of our student population, so we have, there's kind of 3 categories. So there are local Qatari students that are nationals. We also have local expats, and then obviously international students. Within student housing, we're probably about 70% or so international students. Our strategy really was strongly encouraging those that had a local address to go home if they were able to. We also encouraged that by prorating a refund for the remainder of their term, just to make that maybe a little more of an incentive for them to choose to do that. But for some, it's funny about the strength of the internet. I think for some, they wanted to stay because it's an academic environment, the supports are there, and maybe home either not only isn't supportive, but may not be a safe place as well. And so we weren't requiring local students to go home for that reason. And for international students, some did choose to leave right away. But as I said at the beginning, many aren't able to. Qatar is then and now still are allowing people to leave, but not to come in to the country unless they're a national. And so many students they're choosing to stay here because they're worried that even if they do go home and are able to, they might not be able to get back. So as we are now, we're about 60% of our starting occupancy when this all kind of began. But I imagine we'll kind of stay around this point. It's such a moving target, as I imagine that for all of you, as different countries are in different points in terms of this response, and everyone is. The answer is always it depends in terms of different students, especially when we have about 70 to 75 nationalities that are living within our student housing.
Wow. Edwina, what's happening in Australia?
Thanks, Jacob. Well, heaps is happening. So I guess it's a little bit different in Australia in that when all of this emerged, our academic session actually hadn't started. So in late January, early Feb, that's when our student accommodation contract commences. And for us, our government, once the impact of COVID became really clear and where it was taking place initially, our government implemented restrictions to people travelling from China into Australia. And, there were gradual restrictions and then they kept getting, extended. So anyone coming into Australia unless you were an Australian citizen, you just weren't allowed to come in, which meant our students coming over to university were stranded over in China. And So we were at that stage desperately trying to get them over here because we didn't actually know that where we were going to be this far down the track. And it was, I think, Jacob, you probably had a very similar experience. It seemed to be every week that we would be given an update by the government that the restrictions would be extended for another week, and then gradually more and more countries would be added to those blockages. So, and it's pretty much just evolved now to a basic lockdown. We didn't require our students to depart, and in fact, we were kind of encouraging them to stay. Our university adapted to the situation as, I guess, more and more restrictions were put in place within Australia, such as social distancing, gathering. So guidelines were given, were communicated from the government about what that means, of what we needed to do. As with probably most countries, they were given to us or advised to us without very much notice. So we would just always found ourselves scrambling to get that messaging out to students, just to communicate what that means, what they can and are not able to do, and how we were going to support them. So that's pretty much where we are at this stage. As I said earlier, a large majority of our domestic students have chosen to go home. So UOW is now delivering its courses online. We are halfway through session 1. We've just had our mid-session break. Our census date was extended to today, so students have up until today to choose whether to stay or otherwise, they can not enrol without being penalised financially. So we'll have more of an indication of what our enrolments look like. Yes, next week. And we're sitting at about 40% occupancy now. Most of our internationals have chosen to stay. We have families in residence. And then there are those students, some of our domestic students actually just wanted to stay because they were just like, well, we came to university to have this experience and we wanted to meet other people, therefore we want to stay. So they have chosen to stay. And as other people have indicated too, home is not such a great place either. So their preference is to stay in residence. So we're doing what we can to support them, and our student leaders have been fantastic in terms of coming up with really creative ideas. And we're doing what we can to support our student leaders because they're playing such a vital role in just keeping the community engaged and supported, and trying to make it as much as possible like a university experience that they were expecting. So that's where we are at this stage. And we were about 2 weeks ago, we were told that we would be in this lockdown phase until June the 30th. So we're actually given a date. We've got an update today to say that it's now for at least another 4 weeks. So they're gradually, I think what they're doing is giving us worst case scenario and then, drip feeding us with the good news, the so-called good news. So we'll see where we are in 1 month's time.
Brilliant. It's fascinating to hear that we're all fighting a very common, similar virus, and it doesn't discriminate across borders, yet we're all doing such slightly different things with our student populations. We've got a couple of questions there that are really similar, which are, is anyone thinking about delaying their fall semesters or delaying the start of their academic year? I think this will be more applicable to our Northern Hemisphere friends, because Edwina and I, we're in the middle of our academic year and we continue to go right through to November. So maybe Matt, do you want to start off with, do you have any plans to delay your any of your start dates? And then we'll go to Elizabeth and Rebecca.
Sure. As of now, no, it's full speed ahead. So, it is a collaborative decision. So the 9 universities, obviously, 6 from the US, 2 from Europe, and then obviously there's a couple within Qatar Foundation that are part of that are government institutions or homegrown ones. And so for those that have home campuses, they are taking direction from there as well. But as far as we've heard, the contingencies are about starting on time, but potentially starting virtually. I think what they're kind of looking at starting in 3 or 4 different contingencies. One is obviously starting virtually, and then virtual throughout. One is in person throughout. There's also kind of a combination where it might start virtually, and then at some point things are lifted, and then they would have to offer instruction both ways. I think that's one that they're most concerned about, just logistically. How would that be if there are students that can't get into the country, and having to offer things potentially twice? But at this point, we're planning everything virtually, and then we'll wait to see kind of how things change. So for us, that would be into orientation in August, and then classes starting right around the end of August.
Awesome. Rebecca, shall we jump to you?
So we are starting to see some universities in the UK delay their start dates. The University of Aberdeen this week have delayed their start date by 2 weeks. So for those unfamiliar with the structure of the academic year in the UK or this part of the world, students typically start in September. It could be early, mid, late September, depending on the institution. Yesterday, I think it is either UCL or UAL have also delayed their start date as well. And you're seeing people changing their welcome programs. So initially in the UK, what's traditional is that you might have a week with just first year students, and then the second, third, your fourth year students return to campus. And so what you're seeing now is that they're combining those. The big thing that is I guess a topic of concern and conversation is talking with the private operator yesterday, is that they liaise with a lot of international student agents who bring students to the UK and help them find accommodation. And what they're asking them now is, if the term date is delayed, if the university puts it off by a month or longer, will they be penalised financially for that? Will there be force majeure clauses included? And the sector hasn't had to deal with that before. So you see now operators having to put in clauses that they will support the student, they will refund any rental fees for accommodation weeks that they may not use, or they will amend tenancy dates as well, because with students now departing in mass numbers, the big question is, well, do I have to pay rental fees, or why should I pay rental fees for accommodation I'm not using? And the private sector in particular has been heavily criticised for that over here.
Oh, let's not talk about money first, eh? We'll go over to Elizabeth. What's happening over in the continent?
Yeah, I think we are starting to see, similar to the academic year that Rebecca described, conversations with different universities. So in Germany, they've decided to delay the start of their summer semester. And so right now that's scheduled to start May 5th online. So any orientation programs or student welcome programs have been moved to online. In Denmark, we are seeing that things are still TBD, and the same in Poland. So it's interesting, again, to see kind of keep monitoring all of the different countries and how the governments and the university systems are looking to do this. I think similar to what Rebecca mentioned around international students, I think one of the trends that we're starting to see is and being impacted by our countries and universities canceling their summer abroad for the next, not only for kind of the summer semester, but even the next fall or winter semester. And so we're really looking at that. We've seen some of our study abroad partners from the US, particularly CIEE. I'm not sure if any other people out there work with them, but they've actually had to lay off, I saw a story where they had to lay off 600 members of their staff. And so I think that the ripple effects of this around not knowing when the opening is coming, not only for students, but for all of the complementary services that we see, including, in accommodation and otherwise, is really interesting for us. I mean, we are continuing to work with students on a case-by-case basis, depending on visa issues or immigration issues or program issues. And so it just depends on the student and their faculty or their college and their program. And so we don't have a blanket policy because it's such a dynamic time that we really try to work with students and families as they come in and deal with their different questions. So we know for one country, we don't know for the rest of them. And so we're just kind of on our toes for what will happen next.
Awesome, thank you, team. Does anyone offer any suite or shared room style accommodations, and have you had to make any changes to how you configure your occupancy for that? I know here in New Zealand, twin share rooms and shared suites are not are not anything a domestic student would want to be involved in. So actually always being single bedrooms, either in apartments or studios or traditional corridor style, has actually really helped us with our planning for the pandemic. But does anyone offer any twin share or suite or shared styles of accommodation where you've got more than one occupant in a bedroom, and how you might have been changing your occupancy plans to accommodate this for COVID-19? No, we're all single bedrooms. Edwina, you've got some?
Yeah, we do have some twin shares, not a lot. And look, at this stage, we've moved. We have moved some students out of those into another twin share so that they've got their own area. But yeah, we haven't really had to do too much at this stage. They actually seem to be the preferred option for our study abroad students, and most of our study abroad students got pulled and were told to go home. Their home institutions, yeah, frantically called them all home. So it's not really an issue at this stage. We only have a small amount of twin shares though.
Interesting. I've seen Rachel Overton at the University of Canberra has also said that they've had to reduce the number of students in their shared rooms. So yeah, it's hard to maintain physical distancing if you're sleeping less than 2 meters away from each other. Does anyone else have any shared accommodation that they've made some changes to, shared bedrooms or anything, Elizabeth?
So we have a couple of shared options. We are mostly single occupancy rooms. We have a couple of shared options. When the concern started in late February, early March, we started to get questions from roommates whose, one student had a roommate who was returning from Italy, and she was, as the news and the media started to ramp up, there weren't any official, besides WHO guidelines. And so we worked with that student to help find a place where they could self-isolate. I think when media started to come, when the WHO started to really communicate, we started to proactively communicate with students, particularly in shared spaces, about if they had been traveling and how to self-isolate, and to call us and let us know so that we could work with them to make arrangements for them. But in regards to kind of planning ahead in occupancy, we haven't really had any issues with that just yet.
Awesome, thank you, team. We've got a question all the way from Germany, and this is probably not one that we can answer easily, but I suppose it's just, have you had to come up with your own plan maybe, or are you government directed? Do you have any special plans to quarantine students that are potentially infected with COVID-19? I know in my environment, if we do have a suspected case, we have a university mandated plan that's been approved by our Ministry of Health, which is our national that's managing the situation here. So, which is very much being isolated and contact tracing. And then we'll go to Matt to see what's happening in Qatar.
Yeah, so what we did, so the way our housing is arranged, we have 2 complexes of 5 residential buildings in each, and occupancy was low in one building in each of those villages, and so we basically consolidated to free up a building in each. That thankfully we haven't had to use it yet, but the idea is if we had any students that needed to quarantine that have been exposed but weren't showing symptoms, that is where we would move them and support them there in terms of bringing food and services. That being said, you know, if they were actually positive for coronavirus, those buildings might be used as well, but that would have to be our Ministry of Public Health making that determination. We're not planning on using it for that, but we have those spaces available, and they're standalone buildings, so that helps to isolate from the rest of the student housing population. In addition, we've outsourced to bring in a nurse for each of our housing complexes as well, that's on site, able to do screening. And they're the ones who are liaising directly with the Ministry of Public Health on any the screening tool that they use, I guess, for COVID-19 to be able to determine if someone needs to be to have further testing. But that's been a helpful resource as well, connected there to student housing.
Cool. Does anyone else want to jump in before we go to the next question? No, awesome. We've got a couple of questions here that are really similar from our South African chapter. Thank you, Quinton and Bess, which is how would we enforce self-isolation, and are we going to require these students that may live with us or return to us to be screened for COVID-19 before occupancy? So does anyone have any thoughts on that first? Do you want to go, Edwina? Yep.
I can comment on isolation. So at one stage of the process, when international students were coming in, they actually had to isolate for 14 days. So if they were coming into accommodation, we had set aside an area which was set up according to the guidelines of the Department of Health for isolation. And those students were given very clear guidelines about what was expected, the types of support that they would get, but also what would happen if they breached that isolation. And we had security monitoring that too. So it was pretty much laid out to them that not only were they breaching our policies, but it was a legal requirement. So it was pretty clear in that respect.
Yeah, we had a very similar approach in New Zealand for isolating our Chinese students. Matthew, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just added, so similarly, I think that the government is really taking a lead on that. So screening is done at the airport. So anyone that's coming in, and I think it depends on if they're coming from a specific country where the cases are high or something like that. Again, now at this point, it's only country nationals that are able to fly in. But when it was from all different countries, that was the kind of the mechanism of it. But I think the challenge of monitoring students, so, I know that there is, it is a legal matter if someone is gathering out in the community or something like that. But I think one of the other challenges, and you all may have in fact encountered this as well, is for our local students, if they're choosing to live in housing, but they go home for a few days and then come back to housing, kind of monitoring, is that unsafe? Is that similar to going to the grocery store because we're able to do that currently, or is there more risk taken on by choosing to do that and coming back into the community? So we haven't come down on a solution yet, but it's something that's kind of on our minds as we move into our summer term here.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In terms of screening here in New Zealand, the government's dictating where and when tests are occurring. So I know that at a supermarket, they tested 300 people today to get more data in a community there because they didn't feel like they had enough tests. We've talked about if the Ministry of Health dictates that, on-campus student population needs to be tested, we'll all get tested, but there's no requirement to return to campus for you to have been tested. As long as you've not broken what we call your bubble, you should be fine. All righty. We've got a question all the way from Bangladesh. That's awesome being able to read out all these different countries. I'm loving it. Who has said, if your institution only has limited capacity to do online learning, what implication has that had for your residential students? So I'm interpreting this question as if maybe if you're not able to offer all of your courses online, how has that affected some of the students that were doing courses in person on campus? So really interesting question. It's not one I've had to come across at my university. They've even figured out a way to teach fine arts and painting online, go figure. So yeah, maybe we'll go to the UK to see what's happening over there, and then we'll scan back across. Rebecca.
So I haven't heard any stories where there's been difficulties with that regard by any institution. As I mentioned earlier, what we've had seen is students deciding to stay in their accommodation simply because their Wi-Fi connection was better and stronger in their private accommodation than it was in their home because they're from perhaps rural areas. What we do see in terms of like online delivery and learning is that students and staff are taking on these additional roles that they never thought they would have to do, where they're supporting students to do some of their studies. And by that, I mean they're helping them to upload work online. If they can't print things they need to print, if they're having trouble contacting someone in a particular department in the university, they're acting as this kind of go between almost pseudo parent kind of role to assist with that. So quite interesting to hear a perspective from somebody in Bangladesh and what they're dealing with, but nothing like that I'm aware of has cropped up in the UK.
What about in Europe, Elizabeth? Have you had any institutions that you work with struggle with online delivery? Okay, Elizabeth's got some technical difficulty. Matt, what about you? You've got a number of institutions with your housing.
Yeah. So yeah, surprisingly, so as you said, with painting and some other things that maybe you wouldn't think would lend themselves to online education, most everything has been able to be transferable to that. Although what's interesting is some, though, we have a medical school that's here, and some of the things just need to happen in person. For example, there's been a great opportunity, an elective course that's being offered with the Ministry of Public Health, essentially doing research on COVID-19 in the community. But it raised questions about, okay, well, we have these students going to the ministry. Are they in a clinical environment? Are they being exposed? Is there a concern for the community? Thankfully, that was not the case. It's all a kind of more administrative. It's actually probably more secure and safe than just being out in the community in general. But it's interesting because it's, kind of new opportunities are arising, and we have to kind of consider both supporting the students as well as considering, is there a potential community impact for that? But no, we've been really lucky. I think a lot of the universities, or all of them, had business continuity plans in place to go for virtual education, and so they're able to do that pretty smoothly.
That's awesome, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we saw was just this idea of not having class and how that impacted kind of the behavior of students in our residences. So we saw an uptick of partying, and this was particularly when the first social distancing guidelines came out. And so that was really interesting for our student staff, because they had some significant concerns about these people about students and kind of, are they following the guidelines and how much that we can do. And so I think from our perspective, it was interesting to see how students who maybe were just so used to face-to-face class, and the university hadn't fully transitioned to online class, and so they thought that this was a time for them to enjoy their time together, and so that put some interesting tension within our community. We've seen that fade out a little bit as kind of the global situation has become more serious and people are listening. But that's something that that we really started to see, and it put some really interesting tension in our communities.
Awesome, thank you for that, team. We've just had a question come through about how are we supporting our staff through this uneasy time, and it is a really interesting situation to be in. I know that even asking people to work from home and still do their normal job is really interesting with different personal situations. So we'll start with maybe Edwina, and then we'll go over to Rebecca.
Thanks, Jacob. I'm actually really curious to hear how everyone else is supporting their staff. I have just witnessed unbelievable dedication and willingness to get in there, and people just pulling out all stops to ensure that our students are supported, and people just working around the clock in very, very stressful situations, and just pulling in all resources. So it's a really difficult one, because we know that a lot of staff need time off, and it's difficult to take time off at the moment. So if anyone's got any great ideas, I'd be very interested to hear what's going on in your space.
Rebecca, what's happening over in the UK?
Well, I think that's a really great question, because, we work in a sector where there is generally high burnout anyway. And so in this time, it adds a different level. So talking to some operators, they've been struggling with, a lot of their site staff have young children themselves. They might be carers, they might have elderly parents, or they themselves have their own medical issues, so they are considered to be vulnerable. And so what we're seeing is that you have to be really quite flexible. You have to be willing to accommodate people in terms of the hours that they work. But at the same time, you have to make sure that your site and your property and your accommodation is still secure in the event there's a fire or a medical emergency, or any of the other daily operation issues that come up. I myself have been working at home for 6 weeks now. So I decided to work at home just before the official lockdown happened. And our own organisation does things like, having a coffee, Zoom catch up every day. So things like that, so that you're still physically seeing a person, albeit you're not physically present together, have been really good. In addition, what has been really lovely in the UK is that a lot of people in the sector have been coming together to support each other and offer advice and answer questions, and deal with their own issues on top of all that. So we've seen the formation of a global res life support group on Facebook, which has now over 400 members from around the world, and people are sharing ideas about how to build virtual communities and what works really, really well. And that's been amazing and testament to the sector as well. So people can kind of air the things that they're having trouble with and share their grievances, but know that on the other side of that, there's somebody who is a bit of a listening ear and is willing to give you an idea and help you through it.
Awesome, thank you. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we've done is try to remember that people are people first. I think particularly in times of crisis, since usually the people that we work with and ourselves are the first responders, we go into crisis mode. And I think we sometimes can compartmentalize that. And I think that's really one of the things about the situation is that, this is not just impacting the students or the campuses or the residences, this is impacting all of us as human beings. And so I think that's a really important piece. And so I think that the idea of flexibility, the idea of figuring out what actually are your priorities, what really does need to happen, right? And I think that in communicating those to your staff is really important so that they may think that X is the most important thing to do. And so saying, no, you can let that go for a little while, right? Really, we just want you to be able to answer students' questions and to make sure that everyone is safe and healthy, and work towards that. I think the other thing is to have fun. You talked about the coffee pieces. So in my organization, we do a thing called Thirsty Thursday. So we get on a Zoom meeting and we all have our tea or our coffee or our beverages and we do themes to that, right? And so we have a hat theme, and then we share our highs and lows. So we do kind of these traditional res life activities online with the staff, just so that we can connect with each other as people, and make sure that we're doing that. I think the other piece is letting people take breaks. And so what we have done is making sure that, in Europe, we had the Easter holiday, which there's some national holidays that are associated with that. And so that gave people a chance to do those holidays. And so we encouraged people to take time if they need it. And to remember that this is not a time of super productivity. This is a time of let's make sure that we can support everyone and keep things going. So I think that's a really important piece too.
Awesome, thanks for that, team.
Can I just ask Elizabeth, I hope we haven't taken you away from Thirsty Thursday today.
So I did unmute myself. No, my day is bookended with the best parts. So the global Akuho'ai community and then a Thirsty Thursday at the end of it.
Awesome. I think there's a question here that we can just quickly answer around the room with yes, we think so, or no, we don't answers, which is, are we anticipating extreme changes in our student population numbers? I can say in New Zealand, we are Fortress New Zealand. No new international students will be arriving in the country this year, which is a huge financial impact on us, but we're anticipating, as part of retraining the workforce and economic recovery, maybe an increase in mature students. So yeah, Rebecca, what's happening in the UK? And then we'll go Edwina, Matt and Elizabeth.
Big concern in the UK on student numbers, particularly in private accommodation where it's already a competitive sector. We heavily rely, like other countries, on the Chinese cohort, and there's been initial research coming out saying that a lot of students will potentially defer until next year as well. So massive concern for university accommodation and the private sector too.
Awesome, Edwina.
Yeah, Jacob, I think Scott and Jacinta are on the phone each night and notes and follow note. Scott being our Prime Minister, Jacinta being Jacob's Prime Minister, because pretty much the same tact there. So, yeah.
Matt.
Yeah, I think the universities are moving ahead with recruitment. I think a lot will depend on if classes are online, if people are able to come in and all of that. But they're still moving forward and recruiting. so we'll wait to kind of see as that emerges. But what we do know is, I mean, we'll likely have a lot of students that are here anyway because they aren't able to go to their home country. And so I don't think at least from a student housing perspective, our population will change a whole lot in the near future, at least, or up until the fall term, or term one.
Awesome, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think we'll see an initial dip, as everyone has seen throughout the summer, and I think then that hopefully as borders open back up and as study abroad, particularly the Erasmus program, which is a program that kind of allows students within the European Union to study abroad freely. I think as that starts to, that is a huge priority, as I've seen in kind of particularly the EU Commission keeping that going. I think we'll start to see kind of that not only that they talk about the economy having a EU-based recovery, but I think we'll start to see that for us as well.
Awesome, thank you, team. We've had a question out there about, do we have our counselling centre staff supporting our students either virtually or in person? How's that working if they are not on campus, if they've gone back to their home country or different states? Short answer for us is the government's declared our mental health workers as essential workers, and they're still coming on campus and doing virtual support and emergency in-person support with physical distancing. We have no issues there, but I'll go with Matt and then over to Elizabeth, Edwina and Rebecca.
Sure.
Not Elizabeth.
Yeah, our counselor, so each university, so this is a shared service similar to or not a shared service rather, so student housing is a shared service, but the universities each have a psychologist or a licensed counselor, and they are still doing online counseling only, not doing any in-person at this point. They're all working from home. And so I haven't heard of any restrictions or limitations on that. They've been continuing to offer that, not only to students that live in housing, actually still within Qatar, but also wherever students are worldwide.
Awesome. Edwina.
Yeah, pretty similar to Matt, actually. It's virtual. It's all online services for us at UOW. Yeah.
Rebecca, do you have any insights from the UK? I assume yours are very similar.
Yeah, very similar. The role in purpose-built student accommodation is, particularly in strong cases, is to signpost to the relevant university service, which are predominantly based online. However, what I have seen and heard is that a lot of people in that particular field are saying that where they're delivering online mental health support, students are, there's a better rate of students turning up for their appointments because they're preferring online delivery, which is really interesting, because they either have to use a camera or don't have to use a camera and have the option not to use it, or they can just like type in their response and talk with someone. So I think that's going to be quite an interesting development to look at post-COVID.
Yeah, it's going to be a certainly interesting world. We might do, I know we're very close to time. So we'll do one more question, which is about students returning to campus one day. I suppose the recovery phases of COVID-19, there might be a lot more student anxiety or needs for student support. I certainly know that from my own operational context, the Christchurch earthquakes in 2011 had a profound impact on young people 10 years ago that are now coming to university age. And I know that there's those same psychologists that did that longitudinal study are going to lead similar longitudinal studies on how this might create germophobia and make people wary of others. So I was just curious as to what are some other organisations looking at in terms of anticipating student support needs or putting in studies around that. Who wants to jump in first? Maybe Elizabeth. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a really good time for everyone to be reflective and review their policies, their procedures, what their priorities are. I think from my perspective, it's a really important time to review what our staff is trained on and maybe what they need some reminders in and some follow-up in. And I think that everything from mental health first aid to working with cleaning suppliers and maintenance procedures and how we're dealing with that, particularly as social distancing guidelines maybe continue. We just don't know. So I think that this is a really good time to be reflective and to have conversations with people about what do we want to be able to do moving forward, and to make sure that you have the resources to be able to do that, especially as we're all reprioritizing what our resources, because I think our resources are changing.
Awesome. Who wants to go next?
Matt. I could just add on to that. I agree. I think this has been a period of a lot of, throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks kind of thing in terms of supporting students, trying different technologies, different ways. I think as we move forward is to try to institutionalize that a bit. I know for us in the Northern Hemisphere, many do student staff selection during the spring, so already have hired staff, but I think we're looking at, all right, so do we need to train those staff on different skill sets? Do we need to look at the job descriptions and what we're asking them to do and really rewrite a lot of things for a virtual format as we all kind of get used to that? We're kind of seeing the Zoom fatigue with our students and trying to find other ways that we might to be able to support and help them through everything. It's just, all new terrain.
Absolutely. Alrighty, what we might do now is just in the interest of time, I might just ask the panelists to sort of maybe give us some closing thoughts. I know we haven't been able to answer everyone's questions yet, and then we'll pass on to our Kuhawai president. So Rebecca, do you want to give us some of your closing thoughts?
I knew you were going to go to me first, Jacob, for some reason. Closing thoughts. Yes, extremely challenging time for everybody. The word of the day over in the UK is it's an unprecedented time. I think we're sick of hearing that word over here. And just know that everybody is doing the best they can with what they have and to keep going, and that I have loved the opportunity to reach out and speak to people here today, and it's been brilliant to see the sector come together globally and both in their individual countries to support each other. So I hope that will continue going forward when all this is over.
Awesome, thank you. Matt?
Yeah, I guess the thing that I've been thinking about, there's a conference going on here within Qatar that the theme is called Education Disrupted, Education Reimagined. And I really like that thought because I think going into this is crisis mode and just making sure everybody's supported and getting things back to normal. But I think it's an acknowledgement that normal may be different when we're on the other side of that. And that can feel scary, and I feel that part, but I also feel that there's a lot of opportunities and different ways of doing things. And there's some excitement there as well. So trying to channel that energy of, what is this going to look like? And we know that we're important for student support, but that may look very different in the coming year.
Awesome. Elizabeth?
I think one thing that I've really learned is the power of home. I think that whether students see our residences as home or they need to go back to their parents as home, I think that no matter what, I know there's been a lot of conversation about higher education and moving virtually, but I think that, we've seen both the challenges and the opportunity of being students' homes. And I think that reminds me of how important we are and the great work that we do and how we can positively impact lives. But it also reminds me that it's never easy. And so we have to let ourselves off the hook sometimes because we're going to experience lots of challenges. So it's been a really interesting time, and I have no idea how we will, what will it look like in 6 months, but I know that we will still, all of us, be the home for our students.
Beautiful words, thank you. Edwina?
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. And look, thank you to everyone for joining us. I just think it's quite extraordinary that I feel like my global network has just expanded over the last couple of months, more so than what it has over the last couple of years. So I just think the power of networking and supporting each other in the industry is so important, and encouraging everyone to stay networked. Supporting each other, and just, I think, building on what Elizabeth said a little bit earlier, is just really thinking about what is really important, what really matters, and focusing on that. I also referred earlier to the fact that just, I'm witnessing staff just working extraordinary hours. I can't let this one go. The Akuhawai staff that have stayed up all night pretty much to make this happen, which is just, it's just wonderful to see that support, because I think it's great to see this webinar taking place, and I hope we can do some more.
Awesome. Kia ora koutou, everyone, and thank you. I think the final thing that I would just say before passing on to our president, who's gotten up very early for us today, is like Rebecca, we have a similar word that's thrown around all the time. These are uncertain times. But we have a whakatoki here in Māori, which is he waka e kanoa, which is we might be staying home to save lives, but we're all in this together and keep connected. So I'll finish off with that, he waka e kanoa, and then hand it over to our president to wrap up. Thank you, Vaughn.
Well, thank you for the opportunity in order to listen to you all. It is currently 3 o'clock in the morning in the middle of the U.S. in Iowa, which I'm happy to be able to do because I know over my 6 years on the executive board, Edwina, Bess, and Colin have had to get up at weird times in order to facilitate our meetings. So it's the least I can do in order to support our international colleagues. I did want to emphasize also what Edwina said from a standpoint of networking, that this has been a great opportunity to expand our networks and know what's going on in other countries, because we know that some people are ahead of the curve and some people are looking to see what's going to be happening next. So we're happy to be able to share that. I also want to emphasize the fact that I agree that COVID does not discriminate. It's happened in every country, and we're handling them as best as we can based on the information we know. We know that the information that we learn today may change tomorrow. So, I mean, it's always been interesting to try to stay ahead of things. We talk about a new normal. I think that Matt talked about that, and I think that it harkens me to in the U.S. after 9/11. When the World Trade Centers were bombed, we had to live in a world that's a little bit different than it was before that. And I think that's kind of what I hearken to now is how is the world going to be different? How are we going to respond to things differently now after, once we get through this first wave of coronavirus, and as we wait for the next waves, or we wait for a treatment or a vaccine ultimately for that, which is going to be probably 12 to 18 months away. We are certainly experiencing something that maybe, I don't know if unique to the US, but it's called Zoom bombing, where people jump into Zoom meetings and spew hate and vitriol during that time. And it's really disappointing to know that people are out there looking to spread that type of hate during times in which people are trying to just manage. And so that has been a phenomenon which fortunately I haven't had to experience, but I know that my colleagues have. So my final thought is I want to know, I wanted you to share at some point in time what Aku Hawaii can do for you all. We're trying to be able to figure that out. How can we respond as an association rather than just individual universities or individual chapters? I want to know how we're able to support institutions in each country so that we can stand united across the world, saying that we are going to defeat the coronavirus and that we want to be able to support our institutions who support their students. And I think that's why we're all here. So I wish I had great answers to be able to do that, but I'm willing to hear what we can do and try to work toward that. We don't want to be US centric in what our approach is going to be with this, because I think it's a global phenomena, and I think we need to handle it globally, not just by each individual country or each individual institution. So again, thanks everybody for attending. I appreciate everybody's questions and the responses from our excellent panel. And I look forward to talking to you in person, hopefully at a future conference when we start having those again. So.
Thank you, Vaughn. And again, a huge thank you to Jacob. Fantastic moderating, facilitation, outstanding. Rebecca, Matt, Elizabeth, and Edwina, thank you so much for sharing your time, your talents, and just your viewpoints and what you're seeing at your home institutions, and also being able to just connect this network even more. A few housekeeping items before we leave. We do have an ACUI resource page when it comes to COVID-19 resources, so please take a look at that. That is the home of both our straw polls and many resources that you can be using on your campuses. We continue to hold these virtual roundtables for different topical areas and different groups, so please take a look at our upcoming virtual roundtables that we continue to offer. And as always, if there are topics or areas where ACUI can help or get people together to talk about a topic, please send that to us. We want to hear those options. Really, today's virtual roundtable is really caused because we had momentum from members in our field that said, hey, we want to get together, we want to do this. So you're seeing them on webcam today. So thank you. Your positive momentum, your desire to have this, you made it happen. So thank you all for spending a little bit over an hour with us. This will be recorded. This will be put on YouTube. So if you have people that were unable to attend, please find that link after it's posted and share that with them. So with that, I bid adieu. Thank you all so much. Thank you again. Be well. Bye, everyone.